Roddis Lumber and Veneer Company was an integral part of aviation before World War II. Roddis provided aircraft plywood during World War I, interestingly enough. People said, and they were all made out of wooden airplanes. The Havilland Mosquito, when World War II came along, Sir Geoffrey DeHavilland was laughed out of the British Air Ministry. He was told that his wooden airplane was passé, that all new airplanes were going to be made of metal, and that they didn't want anything to do with his airplanes. Of course, there was a small problem. Sir Geoffrey DeHavilland took his men and all his engineers, and he went to Salisbury Hall, which was the home of Winston Churchill. And as the Germans were conquering the sky over England, the British Air Ministry had to come back to him on their hands and knees and say, do you have anything to help us because we are being bombed into submission? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. I have an airplane, and it was, of course, eventually nicknamed the Timber Terror. Its wings were made out of plywood, and where did he get the plywood from? He got it from Roddis Lumber and Veneer Company in Marshfield, also Lullaby Furniture, and it was made in the cold molding process, and it was made out of yellow birch. The Mossy had drop tanks, and it had some very high technology. The drop tanks were one of them. It was new technology. They were honeycombed wings. It was honeycombed inside the drop tanks, as well as honeycombed inside the wings to provide light and quickness. It was the only aircraft of its kind that had a single-engine flying characteristic. No other airplane had that. It also was the fastest airplane in World War II, cruising at 450 miles per hour. Eventually, it started out as the British Air Ministry said, oh, well, you know, it's a wooden airplane, it's not going to be useful for anything, and we're going to make it a reconnaissance airplane. Well, it progressed and progressed and progressed and became a bomber. And at the end of World War II, the British Air Ministry wouldn't ever really relinquish the idea that the bomber, the British Mosquito, could do the same job as the larger Lancaster. For those of you who don't know what a Lancaster is, it looks like B-17, has the same number of crew members, but they could have done the job with two with the Mosquito. People wrote bomb messages on it, and so did the women working here at Roddis Plywood Corporation were writing messages on the plywood that got shipped to England to make the Mossy. The Mossy was also the most precise aircraft as a bomber, and that's why it was chosen for all the missions. It was also the only one that came back intact and had the highest rate of return of all of the pilots and their crew. One pilot was Eric Loveland. He was a Distinguished Flying Cross, and he was also an instructor in the Mosquito, and he transitioned to Hornet, and he flew over, on VE Day, he flew over Buckingham Palace in the Mosquito. The Mosquito, and he said, you know, he said some of my pilot friends would go and polish their wooden airplanes to give it a few more miles per hour. Before the war, leading up to the war, Hamilton Roddis decided that he was going to go to Germany in 1938, and this was a very last-minute addition to the sort of arsenal. When I approached, I couldn't really prove that he had actually gone to Germany, but he did go with his wife Catherine, and he knew that the war was coming. He went and he bought an edge drying veneer machine. He bought a new plywood press, and he bought two other pieces of equipment. Now this is 1938. The war started in 1939. He had 1 year to get the new equipment installed in the plant, okay? So by 1939, knowing that the war was imminent, they took pictures of of all the Roddis employees and all the different divisions. And this is one for the Roddis drying room. And I said I wasn't going to use this laser, but I am going to. See the sign in the back? It says Siempelkamp, Siempelkamp. That just happens to be a German company. And it was also Y, and it was Siempelkamp from Krefeld. Here's the hot press, plywood hot press that they exported to the Roddis company, installed in 1931. And when I approached Siempelkamp and I said, do you have any pictures? They wrote back and said, tell the woman that any of the pictures that we had, her grandfather provided the plywood which bombed our archives, and we have nothing before 1945. So that was kind of a problem. They eventually very nicely provided this picture. But on that trip in 1938, they also were taken to a Hitler youth camp. And in the book, you will see the program. And they went to see a production of The Merry Widow. And it was very providential. The war broke out, and the life changed for everybody here in the United States. Suddenly there was security, there were fences erected around the Roddis company, around all the different sawmills. The Connor Company mill up in Leona had a huge barbed wire fence. Remnants of it are still there. And people wore, just like they do today, ID badges. And you could not get in or out. And it was a big change. Oshkosh Plywood, they had, as Roddis had, they had inspectors in the factory. They had Army officers in the factory watching the production. In Pinocchio and Mellon, where they were also producing plywood for Roddis, for the Mosquito, they had security and badges because sabotage was a very real possibility. For the people, for every normal people, even it affected the war fashions. The fabrics were not readily available, and fabrics that were made out of natural fibers became the fashion. And even the shoes and the shoe heels were affected. If you were a small boy, you had collection aviation cards. You also may have been detailed to the Boy Scouts were here in Wisconsin were taken to Door County to pick buckets of cherries at pennies a pound. I see somebody nodding their head, yes. They also had rubber bands, collecting rubber bands to make rubber balls. They saw tires in streams, and rubber was a very scarce commodity, and the children collected all those items. The women, it was the largest change for women in manufacturing and really in a woman's life. They became Rosie the Riveter. Some of the women, Roddis women, worked in the barn, and the barn is still there. It is visible every time you go down 4th Street, and there were horses on the first floor of the barn. And so the smell was odoriferous in the summer, and it was also very cold in the wintertime. The women were on the 2nd floor using heavy flat irons to iron the veneer, and also to do the splicing of the veneer and filling it in with the glue. Colleen Austin, some of you know, she is Mrs. Marshfield, I think, working with Don Schnitzler and producing the History of Marshfield project. She said, I could not work in the barn. She said, I worked there for one day and I quit. She said, I didn't have the manual dexterity to splice the veneer, and those irons were really heavy, so she became a secretary in the office. Verna Foreman, she's the one that said it was hotter than the hubs in the summertime, and it was colder than freezing cold in the wintertime. She worked for Roddis for over 30 years, and sadly she died last year. I've relied very heavily on Colleen and Verna, and I interviewed Gordie Schmahl, and unfortunately he has passed as well. Gordie Schmahl was a veteran, and he worked for the Roddis company. He was in charge of the glue in the factory, and what made this significant was It was the reason that Sir Geoffrey DeHavilland came to Roddis plywood. Roddis plywood had the only waterproof glue in the United States. Waterproof glue had not even been invented yet. It was not invented in the United States. It was invented by a scientist in 1937 and patented. They didn't believe that he'd invented it. He repatented it in 1939, and it was significant. So where did the glue come from? It came from Germany and our friends from Siempelkamp. And this was, all the glue before that had been dairy-based, and when they sent it to the Pacific and in tropical climates, it curdled like cheese. It's dairy-based, okay? It curdled like cheese, the airplanes took off, and the wings fell off. It was not a good situation. So the glue was a phenylformaldehyde that was invented. It was a phenylformaldehyde resin. And from Germany, a little sticky situation. Okay, Gordie Schmahl was a veteran of World War II, well decorated. Excuse me, Thomas, I have a picture upside down. But he said, and he sort of gave me the recipe when I interviewed him, it was, are you ready? Ammonia, alcohol, formaldehyde, wheat flour, and it smelled horribly, and if you got it on your clothing or you got it on your skin, it gave you, as he said, it gave you the itch. And it was powerful stuff. Everybody knows that, and he made trays and trays of it every day for the gluing of the plywood. The Forest Products Laboratory at the time had tried very hard to make a waterproof glue, and even they did not admit until 1940 that the phenylformaldehyde resin had been invented, and Don Browse was the leading scientist at the time. Leroy, as we were playing with these flyers earlier, I said to somebody, I said, Leroy was a sawyer. He followed Mr. Johnson and at the Roddis plant, and he said, well, we could cut the plywood, we could cut the veneer to 1/90th, and when we dried it, it dried at 1/100th, and they couldn't put it in the dry kilns because it would break and crack and snap in a zillion pieces. So they hung it on the 3rd floor of the Roddis plant with clothespins. And I verified this because Chris Risbud, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Products Laboratory, who just retired last year, worked as one summer in the Roddis plant, and he remembers seeing the plywood hanging, or the veneer hanging on the clothespins. Now, how thick is 1/100th? We were playing with this, and I looked at this and I said, well, this is really thick here. It was so thin that if you held your hand up behind it, you could see your hand. Now notice I can put my hand up behind this and you can't see my fingers. All right. An example of that is at the Marshfield Airport in the case in the Flying Trees exhibit. Leroy, even the Forest Products Laboratory, who tried to cut the veneer to 1/90th, couldn't do it, and they came to Marshfield and Leroy cut samples for them. Sadly, he is gone. The World War II gliders is the significant part of the waterproof plywood. Plywood was that we were providing plywood for the World War II gliders, and this is home of the 82nd Airborne, and I'm very happy to have somebody here, Tom Laney, who's editor of the Badger Airborne News from the 82nd Airborne. It really is the story. It was their proudest moment, and they landed in Normandy, and this is the landing zone. You're talking about there's not an engine on this airplane, everybody. Okay, they're landing in cow pastures. They're landing over the hedgerows, which they didn't anticipate. Everybody thought English hedgerows, oh, that must only be this high. They didn't realize that it was tree height, and so many of them crashed. The casualty rate was enormous. One of the men here in Wisconsin who was trained to be a glider pilot, but wanted to have more of an adventure is Lieutenant Colonel James Megellas, is known as Maggie. He's the most highly decorated 82nd Airborne ever. He fought all the way to Berlin, And he fought from North Africa through Sicily and Anzio, through the Battle of the Bulge, and into Berlin. He has a documentary, if you see it, it's been on PBS recently, it's called Maggie's War. If you have an opportunity, you should see him. He's 97 years old, and he lectures for the Department of Defense on leadership in the face of mortal combat still today. Another person who's from Wisconsin, Maggie was from Fond du Lac, Les Schwarm is from Wausau, and sadly he's gone. He said, I always sat in the 13th seat because they told us that if we sat in the 13th seat, we wouldn't get hit because the Germans didn't know how to shoot straight. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge and was responsible. Here he's shown in front of the Flying Trees exhibit at the 2010 National Glider Symposium. But he's responsible for the memorial in Wausau for the Battle of the Bulge, and he took great pride in that. One of his projects was that he constructed in the recent glider restoration project in Wausau, that he constructed the glider for it. Riding a glider was no easy situation. If you weren't sitting in the dark, which they did, they flew at night. As one person said, close your eyes, shake your chair as hard as you can, and that was what it was like flying the glider. But that didn't, this is also flying in the glider, and this was flying with the mules. And this is in Burma, and the mules like to kick the sides out of the glider, so that was kind of a problem. Frank Parzatka is from Armstrong Creek. He's known as the Polka King in Armstrong Creek. He's also now in his 90s. And this was taken at King Hospital in Wapaka last year. But Wisconsin was also unique because it was a place where we were also training glider pilots. There were 2 World War II glider pilot training centers in Wisconsin. One was in Janesville, the men were housed in the YMCA, and the other one was in Anago. And they were housed in what was a National Youth Administration camp. And it was corrugated steel shed was the essence of it. But they partied like rock stars, I can tell you that. I interviewed a woman recently. She said, I went out on a date with one of them, and she said, that was enough. The gliders were built in Kingsford, Michigan, part of the Ford plant. Ford had built Woody station wagons, and what are we going to do? We're going to turn those Woody station wagons into Woody gliders. And there is a new glider restoration that opened. If you haven't been there in Iron Mountain at the Pump Museum, you ought to go and see it. It took this man, Lloyd, an amazing number of years just to build the restoration. Here is a glider being snatched at Ford. They snatched him right outside of the plant. The plant facility was enormous, and there's still remnants. Another and one of my most favorite places is Northwestern Aeronautical Corporation. Now, as I'm showing this to you, keep in mind that it was the Roddis Lumber and Veneer Company that was providing the plywood for the wood for these gliders. And Ford, it was provided through General Aircraft, through New York, through Steinway. And here in Northwestern Aeronautical in Minneapolis, it was provided directly. Northwestern Aeronautical was founded by John Parker. He was an investment banker who had funded Beech and Cessna and Boeing and everybody. And of course, nobody was flying commercial aircraft at that time at Northwest Airlines. So he got the contract and he started building gliders. And Ford produced about 10,000 some gliders, and Northwestern built about 1,100 of them. These are the women who are showing proudly the tow lines and standing in front of the nose of the gliders as they were assembling them. And it was Northwestern Aeronautical Corporation and DuPonte who were the subcontractors to Northwestern Aeronautical. And notice that the women in the picture, there were millions of women who went into the workforce. Covering with wood, with the plywood, they were covering these glider cockpits. Notice the wonderful construction. I mean, this was a one-way trip for these men, and it was just made out of metal poles. That was it. Would you like to fly in this? I'm not so sure. They didn't have a choice. The men did not have a choice. But one of the things that they decided was the invention, with courtesy of the Forest Products Laboratory, the invention of Papreg. And Papreg was a phenylformaldehyde resin paper. And they pressed, to make a half-inch, they pressed 70 sheets together. And then heated it, and it hardened like plastic. It was the precursor of plastic, and they could mold that plastic into any shape. And they did with these glider nose. And here's what it looks like when it's sort of finished. This was done by, again, Central Wisconsin with Consolidated Paper Company. Now, I think it's new page. But it was Consolidated Paper Company under their subsidiary called Consuelo. Women would sort the sheets of Papreg and then mount them up to be glued. And for us, the first part of Consuelo's, where they got the glider floors, that not only did they make the nose, but they also made glider floors. And they used it, and then they put a screen on it and imprinted it so it would be non-skidding, because they were putting howitzers and jeeps in these gliders. Here's the Consuelo floor. Notice that everything was done to lightness. We talked about the honeycombing. Here's the honeycomb floor to make the floor light. This is the men standing proudly with a finished glider floor. And this is what it looked like in the end. And it was all molded out of this, what you would call Formica today. The Formica is a trade name, but the Consuelo was, that was their trade name. Another glider manufacturer was Pratt Reed Company in Deep River, Connecticut. And their elephant, they were a piano keyboard manufacturer, so they liked to have the elephant head with the tusks to show that they were doing that. Pratt Reed, we supplied directly to Pratt Reed through Steinway again. And it was an amazing story. When we went out to look at it, they had just discovered a whole pile of thin veneer in an old garage, and it had the Roddis stamp in it on all the sheets. Was I excited or what? I got a piece and I brought it home. They made wing panels, and here they're showing the men loading the wing panels on the truck, and the ports, the small circles are the ports on the wings. They loaded the mini bulldozers. It's not a full bulldozer. And probably one of the best stories about the bulldozer is in Burma. When they landed, most of the gliders crashed, and they had less than 48 hours to try to get a runway, and they thought that it was a good place, but it turned out that they had landed in a place that had just been logged, and they hadn't cleared the logs out, and all of the gliders crashed except 3. So they cannibalized all the bulldozers and some of the pieces so that they could build the runway, and the men succeeded in their mission. And that's one thing about the 82nd Airborne. They never talk about the casualty rates. They just talk about the success of their mission and their bravery. They don't talk about their bravery. We talk about their bravery. They also loaded howitzers in them. And Cessna was also a manufacturer of gliders with Boeing and Beechcraft. The Roddis company supplied for this airplane, which it looks sort of like a DC-3, and that's what it is today, or was then. But it's the Bobcat, and in Canada it was the Crane, and that airplane really saved Cessna, and the Roddis company has many wooden parts in that. Boeing had the most amazing. They were granted contracts. Cessna was granted a contract by the mid-1941. They had a government contract for $251 million, and Boeing had added on to their plant location 3 times and had millions of dollars in government contracts. And it was their subsidiary, Stearman, that was providing airplanes. Steinway and Sons, everybody knows Steinway, that's a familiar symbol, piano manufacturers. And I think what people don't understand today is how every company and every manufacturer and everybody was participating in the war effort. And Steinway changed over from being a piano manufacturer to being a glider parts manufacturer. And I was very lucky. I had people who did research for me out in their LaGuardia archives. And here's a picture from their files. And this is what a glider looks like. The men are exiting the glider and running into combat. It was a place where they could land and assemble the troops, sort of like a Green Beret operation where they're bringing the men together after they land. Steinway Women, Mr. Steinway wrote in his book that the women in the plant was such a large change, and he really didn't like it very much. And that because they had to make adjustments for the facilities for the women, and they also had to make new uniforms because the fitting of the uniforms was a little awkward for the women. Here it is, it's the front of the Susie Bell, and the Susie Bell was it really shows the Griswold nose, and that is all made out of plywood. Now Roddis had a unique contribution. When the war broke out, the United States was in a lend-lease situation and providing lots of material, and it went to Europe on board the Liberty ships. Well, there was a problem. The German U-boats were out there in force, and they sank millions of tons of cargo. One of the largest builder of the Liberty ships was Henry Kaiser. And Henry Kaiser had an idea. Well, this is sort of, maybe we should fly these supplies to Europe instead of having all our ships sunk. I'm getting tired of having my ships on the bottom of the sea. And Roddis was supplying all the bulkhead doors and also supplying the fireproof doors for the Liberty ships. Early on in World War I, they had provided pieces of bulkheads and doors for battleships, and even during World War II for battleships as well. But in the interwar years, they were providing plywood for the restoration of a very large cruise ship. So Roddis was able to, very easily meet Henry Kaiser's specifications. Well, Henry Kaiser decided that probably the best way to do this was to create a large airplane. So he did. And it flew, as we know it, as the Spruce Goose in November 7, 1947. This person you might know, some of you might know, he's sitting in the cockpit of the Spruce Goose, but he was tasked with meeting Howard Hughes, who Henry Kaiser went to Howard Hughes was the brains of the operation. When Henry Kaiser decided that he wanted an airplane, the only person that he could turn to was Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes, when he conceived the Spruce Goose, the engines hadn't even been invented yet. He told Pratt Whitney how the engine should be built. He told everybody how that airplane was going to be built. The Forest Products Laboratory participated in the stress tests, and there were supposed to be 3 prototypes built. This was the schematic, one of the schematics of 3. It was going to be conceived as hauling tanks, or as a hospital ship, or as a passenger airplane. The fuselage was longer than a football field by 3 inches. It was enormous. This is inside the fuselage, and the person that's standing, I don't know if you can see him or not, this person standing right there. Okay, looks like this big, but that's a 6 foot tall man. It is an amazing feat. He learned, the aviation world was very small, and he, I don't want to say he copied DeHavilland, but he certainly used his process of cold molding for the Spruce Goose, which was to lay up the strips of veneer and plywood and then mold it. And DeHavilland had done it as an eggshell, in eggshell construction, which made it very easy to put the wires on and everything. And Howard Hughes did the same thing. Here's one of the wings. Again, all plywood, and it's not spruce, everybody. The Spruce Goose was named by the press. Okay, they didn't do their homework. It is not spruce, it is Wisconsin yellow birch. And it is made by Roddis Lumber and Veneer Company, and it came from Vilas County, and it came from the Trostdale Estate. It is made of yellow birch. What is unique about that time is that it was still a time when the men were, there weren't any bulldozer, there were not any heavy machinery. We were still logging, doing railroad logging. The men were still in the logging camps, and they were still logging in the wintertime. It was a tough situation. Logging trucks were like the new invention, and they finally came to the logging camps, and we finally got to modern logging, and that was the change between that was the change from World War II until the end. The roads, the railroad beds became the roads of the future. Bulldozers were invented. Two-man power saws were invented. They started out at 110 pounds. Now that's a heavy piece of equipment. If you're on snowshoes and you have a 5-gallon can of gas in one hand, which weighs 30 pounds, and you're trying with your best to lift this 110-pound two-man power saw with two guys and you're tromping through the woods, that is a huge issue. But it also was considered your patriotic duty to get out there with that power saw. And there were manpower shortages, the labor unions were becoming assertive. There were, the Office of Price Administration was imposing restrictions on prices of logs. The men didn't have enough antifreeze for their bulldozers logging in the wintertime or for their trucks. There were no tires to be had, and there were constant warnings from the tire board, the federal and the state tire board, to take care of your trucks. They didn't have enough pulpwood to make the paper, to make all these pressed paper laminates, and they even had pulpwood parade in Tomahawk to encourage the farmers and everybody else to get out and cut all your pulp down and get it to the mill as fast as possible. To counter many of the restrictions and to deal with the contracts that the timber companies had, they formed the Timber Producers Association, and they were active with the National Lumber Manufacturers Association. It was quite a production for these men to meet all these regulations, and they all decided that working together was better than working as one. That was cute. Logging Congress was created, and the idea was to show everybody the latest technology. At the Roddis Lumber and Veneer Company, proudly they received the victory flag from the Maritime Commission for their work, and it was an incredible amount that they produced. During World War II, in terms of forest products, they produced 26,350 tanks, 297,000 airplanes, 17 million rifles and sidearms, and many of the furniture companies like Sheboygan Furniture, which is run by the Richardsons in Sheboygan, they changed from manufacturing furniture to manufacturing rifles. And that was also true of Vulcan in Anago. They were rifle stocks, not rifles themselves, rifle stocks. Okay. 350 million field artillery pieces, 4.2 million artillery shells were made, and 41,400,000 41,400,000,000 rounds of ammunition, 6,500 Navy ships, 5,400 cargo ships, and 64,500 landing vessels. In terms of timber itself, it is the equivalent of 14 million acres. The northern part of Wisconsin, north of Highway 29, and I'm talking about today has about 16 million acres of timber, and think of that, they used an equivalent 14 million acres of that, so there were only 2 million acres left. William Roddis, who was responsible, as I said, for meeting the specifications of Howard Hughes and getting and creating it so the plywood so it was light enough, and remember our 1/100, light enough, and also having a basswood center pour. He said that on one of his last trips when he was in his 80s, he said, he came back and he said, I saw a yellow birch tree growing, and he said, I never thought I'd see another yellow birch after the World War II. So there you are, and it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing story, the greatest generation, and it's an honor to tell the story of so many of the Marshfield people, and I owe a great debt of gratitude to their contributions and the people that I relied on for interviews and for the employees. So thank you very much.